The millionaire's lawyer walked out, and I'm the 62-year-old janitor who stood up and said, "I'll defend him." That moment still burns in my memory like a brand on my soul. The silence that followed felt like the world had stopped breathing. Maybe you're finishing your rounds, checking the cameras, or closing the building while the world sleeps. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I promise, today's story will touch your heart. My name is Margaret O'Sullivan, but everyone just calls me Maggie. For 37 years, I've been the invisible woman who keeps the prestigious law firm of Blackstone and Associates running in downtown Manhattan. Every morning at 4:30, while the city still dreams, I unlock those heavy glass doors on Park Avenue. My keys jangle like wind chimes in the empty lobby, the sound echoing off marble floors that cost more than most people's houses. I wear the same faded gray uniform every day, the fabric worn thin at the elbows where I've leaned into countless hours of scrubbing. The collar is frayed now, threads coming loose like the edges of my patience. The scent of industrial-strength lemon cleaner has seeped into my very pores. It's been my perfume for decades, masking the smell of other people's messes, other people's carelessness. The attorneys arrive around 8, their Italian leather shoes clicking against my freshly mopped floors. They carry their $1,000 briefcases and their $1,000,000 attitudes, brushing past me like I'm part of the furniture. Sometimes I wonder if they even see me at all, or if I'm just another fixture they've grown accustomed to ignoring. On that particular October morning, the air was different, thick with tension and whispered conversations behind closed doors. The firm's biggest client, Harrison Blackwood III, was facing a federal investigation. His fortune, built on decades of savvy investments in the stock market, was now under scrutiny. There was talk of hidden assets, mysterious cryptocurrency transfers, and offshore accounts holding millions in Bitcoin. The man's net worth was estimated at over $3 billion. But money can't buy you innocence when the FBI comes knocking. I was polishing the mahogany table in conference room A when I first heard the raised voices. Through the frosted glass, I could see shadows moving frantically. Victoria Sterling, the firm's top litigation attorney, was gesticulating wildly. Her voice carried through the walls like a knife-cutting silk. "I won't stake my reputation on this mess," she was saying. "The evidence is damning. The paper trail leads directly to him." I continued my work, dustcloth moving in practice circles. 37 years had taught me the art of selective hearing. But this conversation was different. This was about Mr. Blackwood, the man who'd always acknowledged my existence with a polite nod, who remembered my name when others forgot I had one. You see, Harrison Blackwood wasn't like the other wealthy clients. While they barked orders and treated me like hired help, he spoke to me like a human being. On Christmas morning 2 years ago, when I was working alone in the empty building, he'd stopped by his office to retrieve some files. He found me eating a sad sandwich at the reception desk and quietly left an envelope with my name on it. Inside was a $1,000 bonus and a handwritten note. "Thank you for keeping our world running, Maggie. Merry Christmas." That small gesture of recognition had meant more to me than he could ever know. In a life filled with invisible moments, it was a spotlight of human kindness. But now his world was crumbling, and the vultures were circling. Victoria Sterling was preparing to abandon ship, taking her reputation and leaving her client to drown. I'd seen her build her career on the backs of vulnerable people, charging astronomical fees while delivering minimal results. Her billable hours were legendary, her compassion non-existent. As I dusted the same spot for the 3rd time, I couldn't help but think about my own life, my own sacrifices. How many times had I been abandoned when things got difficult? How many people had walked away when I needed them most? I was born Margaret Mary O'Sullivan in a tiny town outside Savannah, Georgia. My daddy worked the docks, loading and unloading cargo ships until his back gave out when I was 16. Mama took in laundry to make ends meet, her hands raw and red from lye soap and hot water. I was the oldest of 4 children, which meant I became the second mother when times got tough. At 18, I had dreams bigger than our little town could hold. I wanted to go to college, maybe become a teacher or nurse. But dreams don't pay bills. And when Daddy needed surgery we couldn't afford, those dreams got packed away like winter clothes in summer. I moved to New York with $37 in my pocket and a suitcase held together with duct tape. The city was supposed to be where dreams came true, where hard work was rewarded, where people like me could make something of ourselves. Instead, I found myself cleaning office buildings at night while selling tickets at Radio City during the day. That's how I met Thomas, my husband. He was working security at one of the buildings I cleaned. A quiet man with gentle eyes and thick Brooklyn accent, he made me laugh even when my feet were killing me and my back ached from bending over desks and trash cans all day. We married in a small ceremony at St. Patrick's Cathedral. I wore a simple white dress from a second-hand shop, and Tommy looked handsome in his one good suit. We couldn't afford a honeymoon, but we were happy. Young and foolish and desperately in love, we thought our love could conquer anything. Our daughter Susan was born 2 years later. Sweet Susan with her father's eyes and my stubborn chin. I remember holding her for the first time, promising her she'd have everything I never did. She'd go to college. She'd have choices. She'd never clean anyone's mess but her own. But life has a way of making liars out of the most well-intentioned promises. Tommy died when Susan was only 12. A heart attack at 42, sudden and cruel and final. One minute he was laughing at something on television, the next, he was gone. The funeral costs ate through our meager savings like fire through paper. The insurance money barely covered 3 months of rent. That's when I took the job at Blackstone and Associates. Better pay, steady hours, and medical benefits that would keep Susan healthy and in school. I told myself it was temporary, just until I could get back on my feet. Temporary became permanent, and permanent became decades. I missed Susan's first school play because Mr. Blackstone Sr. needed the conference rooms cleaned for an emergency meeting. I missed her graduation because the partners were hosting a celebration for landing a major client worth millions in revenue. I missed her wedding because the office was preparing for a merger that would generate hundreds of millions in fees. Always someone else's priorities came first. Always someone else's needs trumped mine. And slowly, quietly, I began to disappear. Not just from my daughter's life, but from my own. Susan grew up, moved to California, started her own family. She calls every Sunday, our conversations polite but distant. She asks about my health. I ask about the grandchildren I've only met through photographs. We dance around the elephant in the room. All those moments I chose, work over her. All those times I wasn't there when she needed me. You could have said no, Mom, she told me once during a particularly honest conversation. You could have chosen differently. But she didn't understand. When you're poor, when you're alone, when you're responsible for keeping a roof over your child's head, no becomes a luxury you can't afford. Every cleaning shift was Susan's lunch money. Every missed moment was her future security. I traded my presence for her prosperity, and the guilt of that exchange has haunted me ever since. At Blackstone and Associates, I became part of the infrastructure, like plumbing or electricity, essential but invisible. The attorneys would discuss their most sensitive cases in front of me as if I were deaf and mute. Affairs, bribes, cover-ups, financial manipulations worth millions. I heard it all while emptying their wastebaskets and wiping down their desks. The younger attorneys were the worst. Fresh out of law school with their sense of entitlement intact, they treated support staff like servants. Coffee orders barked without please or thank you. Messes left deliberately for someone else to clean. Snide comments about the help when they thought no one was listening. Make sure the bathroom is spotless, Associate Peterson would snap. The clients pay too much to see soap scum on the mirrors. Associate Williams was worse. She'd deliberately knock papers off her desk, then watch me pick them up with a smirk on her perfectly made-up face. Once, she accused me of stealing her expensive fountain pen making a huge scene in front of the other partners. The pen was later found in her briefcase, but no apology ever came. Just a dismissive wave and a muttered comment about these people not knowing their place. But the humiliation that cut deepest happened 3 winters ago. The firm was hosting its annual holiday party, a lavish affair in the main conference room. Catered food, open bar, bonuses announced with great fanfare. I was working late that night, cleaning up after the celebration I wasn't invited to join. Victoria Sterling found me in the kitchen, loading dirty glasses into the dishwasher. She'd clearly had too much champagne, her professional composure slipping like a mask coming loose. "You know, Maggie," she said, leaning against the door frame with calculated casualness, "I've always wondered what it must be like to have such simple needs. No ambition beyond a paycheck, no dreams beyond tomorrow." Her words landed like physical blows. But what hurt more was the laughter that followed from her colleagues who'd gathered to watch the show. My pain was their entertainment, my dignity their punchline. That night, I went home to my tiny apartment in Queens and cried until I had no tears left. I looked around at my life, at the second-hand furniture and the photo of Susan that was 3 years out of date, at the stack of bills on my kitchen table and the medical prescriptions I couldn't afford to fill. When had I become so small? When had I accepted that this was all I deserved? The wake-up call came gradually, like dawn creeping across a dark sky. Small indignities piling up until they formed a mountain I couldn't ignore. Being excluded from staff meetings where my input might actually matter. Having my schedule changed without consultation, my time treated as if it belonged to everyone but me. Watching younger, less experienced people get promoted while I remained invisible in my gray uniform. The breaking point came 6 months ago. I'd been fighting a persistent cough for weeks, probably pneumonia, but couldn't afford to take time off for a doctor's visit. My sick days had been used up caring for Mrs. Rodriguez next door when her husband had his stroke. She had no family, no one else to help, so I'd taken vacation time I'd been saving for a visit to Susan. On a particularly bad morning, I was cleaning the senior partners' conference room when a coughing fit doubled me over. I couldn't catch my breath, couldn't stop the painful spasms that felt like my lungs were trying to escape my chest. Partner Davidson found me there, gasping and sweating, holding onto the edge of the mahogany table for support. "Are you contagious?" was his first question. Not, "Are you all right?" or "Do you need help?" Just concern for his own health and that of his precious clients. When I shook my head, unable to speak through the coughing, he frowned. "Well, can you finish cleaning? We have an important meeting in an hour, and this room needs to be perfect." That's when something inside me cracked. Not broke, cracked, like ice under pressure, creating fissures that would eventually shatter everything. I finished cleaning that room, but something fundamental had changed. For the first time in 37 years, I began paying attention to the conversations I'd been trained to ignore. The casual discussions of million-dollar investments, billion-dollar mergers, cryptocurrency portfolios worth more than entire countries' gross domestic product. These people had assets I couldn't even comprehend. Harrison Blackwood's portfolio alone included stocks in companies that dominated the Dow Jones, real estate holdings across 3 continents, and enough Bitcoin to make him one of the largest individual holders in the world. The firm's clients routinely discussed interest rates, dividend payments, and capital gains in amounts that made my annual salary look like pocket change. Yet they quibbled over my health insurance coverage. They complained about the cost of my annual 2% raise. They treated my time, my life, as if it had no value beyond their immediate convenience. The revelation was crushing and liberating at the same time. Crushing because it confirmed how little I mattered in their world. Liberating because it finally gave me permission to stop caring about their opinion of me. I started small. When Associate Williams left another deliberately messy pile of papers for me to organize, I left them there. When Peterson demanded I stay late to clean up after his private client dinner, I reminded him that overtime required advance notice. When the holiday party came around again, I didn't work that night. I went home, ordered Chinese takeout, and watched old movies until I fell asleep on my couch. Each small act of defiance felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, like finding fragments of the woman I used to be scattered throughout the decades of servitude. But the real awakening came when I discovered what had happened to my pension. I'd been contributing to the firm's retirement plan for 37 years, faithfully setting aside money from each paycheck for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. The statements came quarterly, showing steady growth that should have resulted in a comfortable retirement fund. But when I finally sat down with the HR representative to discuss my options, the numbers didn't add up. My pension had been invested primarily in company stock, which had performed poorly over the past decade. Worse, there were management fees I'd never been informed about, administrative costs that had been eating away at my contributions like termites in wood. Of course, you understand that market conditions affect all investments, the HR manager explained, with the practiced patience of someone delivering bad news to stupid people. Your fund has actually outperformed similar portfolios when you account for sector volatility and management expenses. In simpler terms, 37 years of contributions had resulted in a pension that might cover basic expenses for 5 years if I was lucky. 5 years of careful budgeting, no emergencies, no unexpected medical bills, no life at all. The American dream, it turned out, was just that, a dream. And I'd been sleepwalking through mine for decades. That night, I called Susan for the first time in months, not our usual Sunday conversation, but a real call. A mother reaching out to her daughter not out of obligation, but out of need. "Susan," I said, my voice shaking, "I think I've made some terrible mistakes." She listened as I told her about the pension, about the years of missed moments, about the slow erosion of my dignity and self-worth. She cried, and I cried, and for the first time in years, we were really talking to each other. "Come to California, Mom," she said. "Come live with us. The kids would love to have their grandmother around, and Mark's been saying we need someone to help with after-school care." But even as part of me yearned for that connection, another part rebelled. I'd spent so many years defining myself through service to others. Was I ready to become the helpful grandmother, the convenient childcare solution, the woman whose value was measured by her usefulness? "Let me think about it," I said, which we both knew meant no. After that conversation, something shifted in my relationship with work. I began to see Blackstone and Associates not as my employer, but as my adversary. Every slight, every dismissal, every moment of casual cruelty became evidence in a case I was building against them in my mind. I started keeping a journal, writing down the things I witnessed, the conversations I overheard, the patterns of behavior that revealed the firm's true character. Not for any specific purpose at first, just to have a record, to prove to myself that these things really happened. The entries began simply. October 15th. Partner Davidson asked me to work Saturday without overtime pay. Said it was for the good of the firm. October 22nd, Victoria Sterling left coffee cup on floor deliberately after I asked her not to put cups on the carpet. When I didn't clean it immediately, she complained to management about my attitude problem. November 3rd, overheard conversation about billing client for research that was never conducted. Total fraudulent charges, $47,000. That last entry stopped me cold. I read it again, making sure I'd heard correctly. But there it was, clear as day. The firm was billing clients for work that didn't exist, padding their hours to increase profits, treating their clients' trust as just another revenue stream. Over the following weeks, I began paying closer attention to these conversations. The lawyers spoke freely in front of me, confident in my invisibility, and what I heard made my stomach turn. Falsified documents, suppressed evidence, conflicts of interest that put client welfare second to firm profits. But it was Harrison Blackwood who occupied my thoughts most often. Unlike the others, He'd never treated me as invisible. He knew my name, asked about my health, remembered details about my life that others forgot immediately. When other clients demanded perfection from the help, he thanked me for my service. His case was different too. While the firm's other clients were often guilty of the crimes they were accused of, Harrison was being framed. I'd heard enough conversations, seen enough documents being shredded, witnessed enough nervous phone calls to piece together the truth. The government's case against him was built on falsified evidence provided by his former business partner, Marcus Webb. Webb had been embezzling money from their joint ventures for years, using Harrison's investment accounts to hide the stolen funds, then disappearing when the federal investigation began. The firm knew this. Victoria Sterling had uncovered evidence of Webb's fraud months ago, but instead of presenting it to clear her client, she'd buried it. Webb had promised her a lucrative position at his new company if Harrison was convicted and sent to prison. The conflict of interest was staggering, the betrayal absolute. But who would believe a janitor? Who would listen to someone like me? That question haunted me through the long winter nights as I mopped floors and emptied trash cans, surrounded by the evidence of corruption that no one would ever let me present. I felt like a witness to history with no voice to tell the story. The breaking point came on a bitter February morning. I arrived at work to find police cars outside the building, their red and blue lights painting the gray dawn in carnival colors. Federal agents were already inside, serving warrants, boxing up documents, treating the prestigious offices like a crime scene, which I supposed they were. Harrison sat in conference room A, hands folded calmly in his lap while Victoria Sterling paced like a caged animal. Through the glass, I could see her gesturing frantically, her composure finally cracking under pressure. "The evidence against you is overwhelming," she was saying. "Bank records, cryptocurrency transactions, witness testimony, everything points to your guilt." "But you know I didn't do this," Harrison replied quietly. "You have proof that Webb was the one." "What I have," Victoria interrupted, "is a career to protect, and I won't let your mess destroy everything I've built." That's when she did it. Right there in front of him, in front of the federal agents, in front of me standing frozen in the doorway with my cleaning supplies. She quit. "I can't represent someone I don't believe in," she announced to the room. "Mr. Blackwood, you'll need to find other counsel." The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison sat stunned, abandoned by the person who'd promised to defend him. The federal agents looked satisfied, knowing that without proper representation, their case would be much easier to win. And I stood there, invisible as always, holding the truth that could save him. That's when something extraordinary happened. Something I still can't fully explain, even to myself. Every humiliation I'd endured, every slight I'd swallowed, every moment I'd been treated as less than human, suddenly crystallized into a moment of pure clarity. "I'll defend him." The words came out of my mouth before my brain had time to stop them. Every eye in the room turned toward me, as if they were seeing me for the first time. "Excuse me?" Agent Martinez said, his voice mixing confusion with annoyance. I said I'll defend him. My voice was stronger now, more certain. "I know what really happened. I have evidence." Victoria Sterling laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that cut through the tension. "You? You're a janitor. You don't even have a high school diploma." But Harrison was looking at me with something I'd never seen directed my way before. Hope. "What kind of evidence?" Agent Martinez asked, his training overriding his skepticism. I thought about my journal, about the conversations I'd overheard, about the documents I'd seen being shredded, and the phone calls made when lawyers thought no one was listening. I thought about 37 years of being invisible, of being treated as if I didn't matter, of watching powerful people destroy lives for profit. "The kind that will prove his innocence," I said simply. What happened next changed everything, not just for Harrison, but for me. For the first time in my adult life, people were actually listening to what I had to say. Agent Martinez asked me to sit down, to tell my story from the beginning, and I did. I told him about the conversations I'd overheard between Victoria Sterling and Marcus Webb, about the documents I'd retrieved from trash cans and pieced back together, about the phone calls I'd witnessed where evidence was discussed and destroyed. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" he asked. The question hung in the air like smoke. Why hadn't I? Fear, mostly. Fear of not being believed, of losing my job, of being dismissed as just another disgruntled employee. But also something deeper. A lifetime of being told that my voice didn't matter, that my observations weren't important, that I should stay in my lane and mind my own business. Because nobody listens to people like me, I answered honestly. Until today. Harrison's new legal team, court-appointed but competent, was amazed by what I'd documented. My journal entries provided timestamps for conversations that contradicted official firm records. The documents I'd pieced together showed a pattern of evidence destruction that pointed directly to Victoria Sterling's collusion with Marcus Webb. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source, the firm's own security system. As the building's janitor, I had access to areas others didn't, including the security office where backup recordings were stored. While the firm's lawyers had destroyed the official recordings of certain meetings, they'd forgotten about the backup drives that were automatically created and stored in a fireproof safe. Those recordings captured Victoria Sterling's conversations with Webb in stunning detail. Plans to frame Harrison, agreements to split the stolen money, even discussions of how to eliminate any witnesses who might interfere with their scheme. The case that had seemed airtight against Harrison began unraveling like a cheap sweater. Webb was arrested in the Cayman Islands, trying to flee with nearly $200 million in stolen cryptocurrency. Victoria Sterling was indicted for fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. And Harrison Blackwood was exonerated completely. The media called it the janitor's justice, the story of how an invisible woman brought down a corrupt legal empire. Reporters camped outside my tiny apartment in Queens, wanting to know how it felt to be a hero. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like someone who'd finally found her voice. The trial became a sensation. Here was David versus Goliath with a twist. David was a 62-year-old woman in a gray uniform who'd spent decades mopping floors and emptying trash cans. The gallery was packed every day, people coming to see the woman who'd taken on the legal establishment and won. Victoria Sterling's defense team tried to discredit me, of course. They painted me as a bitter employee seeking revenge, an unreliable witness with no legal training and an axe to grind. They questioned my memory, my motives, my right to even be in their courtroom. But the evidence spoke for itself. Document after document, recording after recording, a paper trail that even the most expensive lawyers couldn't explain away. When I took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. All those years of being ignored had taught me something valuable. How to observe, how to listen, how to remember details that others missed. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," the prosecutor said gently, "can you tell the court why you decided to come forward?" I looked out at the packed gallery, at Harrison sitting with his family, at the reporters scribbling notes, at Victoria Sterling avoiding my gaze. "Because," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of that room, 37 years of being invisible taught me that sometimes the most important things are hidden in plain sight. And sometimes the people nobody expects to speak up are the ones with the most important things to say. The verdict was unanimous. Victoria Sterling was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Marcus Webb got 25. The firm of Blackstone and Associates was dissolved, its assets liquidated to compensate the clients they'd had defrauded over the years. But for me, the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the aftermath, when everything settled and life returned to something resembling normal. Harrison paid for Susan's flight from California so she could attend the trial. Seeing her in that courtroom, watching her beam with pride as her mother testified, was better than any legal victory. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," she said afterwards, tears streaming down her face. "I always knew you were stronger than you thought you were." The civil settlement from the firm was substantial. Compensation for 37 years of witnessing their crimes, for the valor of speaking up when it mattered most. Enough money to secure a comfortable retirement, to visit my grandchildren whenever I wanted, to finally see the world beyond office buildings and mop buckets. But money wasn't the most valuable thing I received from this experience. I found my voice. After decades of silence, of swallowing humiliation, of accepting that my thoughts and feelings didn't matter, I learned that they did. Not because anyone gave me permission to speak, but because I finally gave myself permission to be heard. The transformation didn't happen overnight. 62 years of conditioning don't disappear with a single moment of courage. There were still days when I caught myself apologizing for taking up space, when I felt the old, familiar urge to make myself smaller, less noticeable, less troublesome. But those moments became fewer and farther between. Each time someone tried to dismiss me, each time someone assumed I didn't understand or didn't matter, I remembered that courtroom, that moment when my voice carried weight, when my truth changed everything. I moved out of my tiny apartment in Queens and into a comfortable condo in Brooklyn Heights, close enough to Manhattan that I could visit the old neighborhood when nostalgia struck, far enough away that I didn't have to relive the painful memories every day. The first morning in my new home, I stood on the balcony with a cup of real coffee, not the cheap instant I'd been drinking for years, and watched the sunrise paint the East River gold. For the first time in decades, I had nowhere to be. No floors to mop, no trash to empty, no one else's mess to clean up. The silence was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. I called Susan that morning, not because it was Sunday and that was our scheduled time, but because I wanted to hear her voice. "I've been thinking," I told her, "about your offer, about California." "Oh, Mom," she said, and I could hear the hope creeping into her voice. "I'm not ready to move in with you," I said quickly. "But maybe I could visit. Maybe we could spend some real time together. I'd like to get to know my grandchildren, and I think I'm finally ready to learn how to be a grandmother instead of just a provider." She cried then, and so did I, but they were good tears. Healing tears. The visit to California lasted 2 months. I met my grandchildren properly for the first time, Sarah, who was 7 and had my stubborn chin, and Michael, who was 5, and had his grandfather's gentle eyes. They were shy at first, but children have a way of seeing through surface differences to the heart underneath. Sarah asked me why I'd never visited before, and I struggled to find an age-appropriate way to explain decades of misplaced priorities and financial struggles. "I was working," I said finally, "taking care of other people, but forgetting to take care of myself and the people who really mattered." "Are you done working now?" Michael asked. "The old kind of work, yes," I said, "but I'm starting a new kind of work now, taking care of family, taking care of myself, learning how to be happy." When I returned to New York, I was different, not just because of the money or the fame from the trial, but because I'd remembered who I was before I became invisible. I was Margaret Mary O'Sullivan, daughter of dock workers and laundresses, mother and grandmother, survivor and fighter. The first thing I did was visit Mrs. Rodriguez, my elderly neighbor who'd been struggling since her husband's death. This time, though, I came not as someone sacrificing her own needs to help others, but as someone with the resources and freedom to choose how to spend her time and energy. "Maggie," she said when she opened the door, her aged face lighting up with surprise, "I heard about the trial on the news. I always knew you were special." We spent the afternoon going through her husband's papers, organizing the medical bills and insurance claims that had been overwhelming her. But instead of rushing through the tasks so I could get to my next obligation, we took our time. We talked about her husband, about my Thomas, about the strange turns life takes, and the strength we find when we need it most. That evening, I sat in my new living room surrounded by the luxury I'd never imagined I could afford, but I found myself thinking about something Victoria Sterling had said during her deposition. "You people," she'd sneered, "you think that just because you've suffered it makes you noble, but suffering doesn't make you special, it just makes you bitter." At the time, her words had stung, but now I understood she was both wrong and right. Suffering alone doesn't make anyone noble. Plenty of people become bitter and cruel in response to pain. But suffering combined with choice, with the decision to remain human in the face of inhumanity, with the courage to speak up when it matters, that does create something special. Not nobility, exactly. Something simpler and more profound. Authenticity. For 37 years, I'd worn a mask of compliance, agreeing with people who dismissed me, accepting treatment that diminished me, apologizing for existing in spaces where my presence was inconvenient. The mask had become so familiar, I'd forgotten it wasn't my real face. But when I stood up in that conference room, when I said, "I'll defend him," the mask finally slipped away. What was left wasn't perfect or polished or particularly impressive. It was just real. The speaking engagement started a few months after the trial ended. Labor organizations, women's groups, community centers, they all wanted to hear from the janitor who'd brought down a corrupt law firm. At first, I was terrified. Public speaking had never been part of my skill set, and the idea of standing in front of crowds of strangers seemed impossible. But the first speech changed my perspective completely. It was at a community center in the Bronx, speaking to a group of women who worked in service industries, hotel housekeeping, office cleaning, home health care. Women who understood what it meant to be invisible, to have their voices dismissed, to be treated as less than human by people who couldn't function without their labor. I looked out at their faces and saw myself reflected back. Tired eyes, work-worn hands, shoulders bent under the weight of other people's expectations. But I also saw something else, a spark of recognition, a sense that maybe their stories mattered too. "I'm not here to tell you how to live your lives," I began, my voice shaky but growing stronger with each word. "I'm here to tell you that your lives have value, even when the people around you act like they don't. I'm here to tell you that your voice matters, even when no one seems to be listening." The response was overwhelming. Women came up afterward to share their own stories of invisible labor, of dreams deferred, of voices silenced by circumstance and conditioning. They thanked me for speaking up, but what they didn't understand was how much their courage inspired me. Each speaking engagement became easier, not because I became more comfortable with public attention, but because I realized I wasn't really the focus. I was just a vehicle for a message that needed to be heard. That dignity isn't determined by job titles or bank accounts, that worth isn't measured by visibility or social status, that every person has value regardless of how society chooses to categorize them. The book came next, though that was never my intention. A publisher approached me about writing my story, and my first instinct was to refuse. What did I know about writing books? What made me think anyone would want to read my words? But Susan convinced me to try. "Mom," she said during one of our now regular phone calls, "you've spent your whole life thinking that your thoughts and experiences don't matter. Maybe it's time to find out if you're wrong." The writing process was harder than I'd expected. Not the technical aspects. I'd kept journals for years, and the words came easily once I started. But the emotional excavation was brutal. Reliving 37 years of small humiliations, of dreams sacrificed on the altar of survival, of watching my own life shrink while I served others, left me raw and exhausted. But it was also liberating. Each chapter was an exorcism, casting out decades of internalized shame and self-doubt. By the time I finished, I felt lighter, cleaner, like I'd finally washed away the residue of all those years of being treated as disposable. The book, Invisible No More, A Janitor's Journey to Justice, became an unexpected bestseller. Not because people were fascinated by legal drama or corporate corruption, but because it touched something universal, the experience of feeling undervalued, overlooked, dismissed by a society that measures human worth in dollars and status symbols. The reviews were mixed, as I'd expected. Some critics dismissed it as poverty porn or inspiration bait, arguing that my story was an anomaly, that most people in service positions don't have access to the evidence or opportunities that I'd stumbled upon. They weren't wrong, exactly. I'd been extraordinarily lucky, if you can call 37 years of invisible labor lucky. But they missed the point. The story wasn't about replicating my specific circumstances. It was about recognizing that every person has value, every voice has power, every life has meaning beyond its utility to others. The money from the book sales, combined with the civil settlement and my careful investments in a diverse stock portfolio, including some blue-chip stocks and even a small position in Bitcoin, gave me financial freedom I'd never dreamed possible. But more importantly, it gave me the platform to amplify voices that had been silenced the way mine had been. I established the Invisible Voices Foundation, focusing on legal aid for service workers and support for people trying to expose workplace corruption. The foundation's first major case involved a group of home health aides who discovered their employer was billing Medicare for services never provided while paying workers below minimum wage. Watching those women find their voices, seeing them stand up to employers who'd treated them as expendable, felt like watching my own story repeated with variations. Each victory was personal, each setback a reminder of how much work remained to be done. But the most profound changes were private, internal, invisible to the outside world. I learned to say no without apologizing. When the local community center asked me to clean up after their events just this once, I politely declined instead of automatically agreeing. When my downstairs neighbor assumed I'd be happy to babysit her children because I was retired and probably lonely, I explained that my time was my own to manage. These small moments of self-advocacy felt revolutionary after a lifetime of automatic compliance. I reconnected with old friends from my Georgia hometown, people I'd lost touch with during my years of working multiple jobs and raising Susan alone. Social media made the connections possible, but it was my newfound confidence that made them meaningful. Martha Ellis, my closest friend from high school, was the first person I called. We'd been inseparable as teenagers, dreaming of the lives we'd build, the places we'd see, the women we'd become. Life had taken us in different directions. She'd stayed in Georgia, married her high school sweetheart, raised 4 children on a teacher's salary. "Maggie O'Sullivan," she said when she heard my voice, pronouncing my name like a song she'd been waiting decades to sing again. "I saw you on the news. I told everyone in town. That's my Maggie." I always knew she was destined for something special. We talked for 3 hours that first call, catching up on 4 decades of separate lives, finding the common threads that still connected us despite the years and distance. She invited me to visit, and for the first time since leaving Georgia, I felt ready to go home. The town had changed, of course. The docks where my father had worked were largely automated now, the jobs that had supported working families replaced by machines and efficiency. But the essential character of the place remained, the slow pace, the genuine warmth, the sense of community that I'd been searching for in Manhattan's anonymous towers. I visited my parents' graves for the first time in 20 years, carrying flowers and apologies and stories about the granddaughter they'd never met. Standing there in the small cemetery overlooking the Savannah River, I felt something shift inside me, not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of peace with the choices I'd made and the prices I'd paid. "I did the best I could with what I knew then," I said aloud, my words carrying across the Spanish moss and weathered headstones. "I'm doing better now." The visit to Georgia became an annual tradition. A pilgrimage to the girl I'd been before New York hardened me into survival mode. Each trip healed something I hadn't even realized was broken. But it was the relationship with Harrison Blackwood that surprised me most. After the trial ended and his name was cleared, I expected him to disappear back into his world of private jets and exclusive clubs, grateful but distant. Instead, he became something I'd never had before, a genuine friend. It started with a simple thank you lunch at a restaurant so expensive I felt guilty looking at the prices. But as we talked, I realized that wealth hadn't insulated him from loneliness any more than poverty had insulated me. He'd been surrounded by people who wanted something from him, lawyers, business partners, relatives with investment schemes, but few who simply enjoyed his company. "You saved my life," he said over coffee that probably cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a week. "I just told the truth," I replied. "That's what saved my life," he said. The truth. I'd been surrounded by people telling me what they thought I wanted to hear for so long. I'd forgotten what honesty sounded like. Our friendship deepened slowly, built on shared meals and long conversations about everything except money and legal drama. He told me about his childhood as the heir to a business empire, the pressure to succeed, the isolation that came with extraordinary wealth. I told him about my childhood as the daughter of dock workers, the pressure to survive, the isolation that came with grinding poverty. In many ways, we'd lived opposite lives, but we'd both learned what it meant to be defined by other people's needs, to have our worth measured by our utility, to disappear into roles that others had created for us. The difference was that his role came with luxury, and mine came with struggle, but the essential experience of invisibility was the same. Harrison introduced me to parts of New York I'd never seen despite living there for decades. Not the tourist attractions or famous landmarks, but the quiet corners where the city revealed its true character. Neighborhood cafes where the coffee was perfect and the conversation was real. Bookstores tucked into brownstone basements, parks that most people walked past without noticing. Through his eyes, I began to see the city not as a place that had worn me down, but as a place full of possibilities I'd never allowed myself to explore. He also helped me understand the world of investment and wealth that had always seemed so foreign. Not to make me wealthy, the settlement and book sales had already done that, but to help me understand how money could be a tool for change rather than just survival. "Money isn't evil," he explained during one of our walks through Central Park, "but the pursuit of money at the expense of everything else, that's where the corruption begins." With his guidance, I diversified my investments beyond simple savings accounts. A portfolio of stable stocks, some government bonds, a small position in cryptocurrency that I didn't entirely understand but trusted his judgment about. Not to get rich, I had enough for my needs, but to ensure that the foundation would have resources to continue its work long after I was gone. But perhaps the most valuable thing he gave me was perspective on forgiveness. "Aren't you angry?" I asked him one day. "About Victoria, about Marcus Webb, about almost going to prison for something you didn't do?" He was quiet for a long time, watching joggers circle the reservoir while he considered his answer. "I was angry," he said finally, furious, consumed with rage at the injustice, at the betrayal, at how close I came to losing everything I'd worked for. "What changed?" "You," he said simply. "Watching you testify, seeing how you'd turned 37 years of invisible suffering into something powerful and purposeful. It made me realize that anger was just another kind of prison. I could stay angry and let their betrayal define the rest of my life, or I could focus on what came next." His words stayed with me through the months that followed, especially when old hurts resurfaced or new challenges arose. The temptation to remain bitter was always there, to use my story as justification for anger at a system that had dismissed me for so long. But bitterness, I realized, was just another form of invisibility. It made me disappear into my own pain, unable to see beyond my own suffering to the possibilities that lay ahead. The second book came 2 years later, though this one was different. Instead of focusing on my story, Voices from the Margins collected stories from other service workers who'd found their courage to speak up, hotel housekeepers who'd exposed unsafe working conditions, home health aides who'd reported elder abuse, janitors who'd witnessed corporate fraud and found the strength to testify against their employers. Each story was unique, but the themes were consistent: the power of bearing witness, the importance of truth-telling, the transformation that comes when invisible people refuse to remain silent. The book tour for that one was even more meaningful than the first. Instead of speaking to audiences who saw me as an inspiring anomaly, I was connecting people with similar experiences, creating a network of voices that had been isolated in their individual struggles. At a community center in Detroit, a woman approached me after my reading. She was probably in her 50s, wearing a hospital worker's uniform, her face etched with the exhaustion I recognized from my own mirror in earlier years. "I've been thinking about coming forward," she said quietly, "about some things I've seen at work, but I'm scared." "What scares you most?" I asked. "That no one will believe me, that I'll lose my job, that nothing will change anyway." I thought about my own fears, about the decades I'd spent telling myself the same things. "Those are all real risks," I said honestly. "But here's what I learned. Staying silent is also a risk. The risk of watching other people get hurt when you could have prevented it. The risk of living the rest of your life knowing you had the chance to make a difference and chose safety instead." She nodded slowly, and I saw something shift in her expression, the same crack in the fear that I'd felt in that conference room all those years ago. 6 months later, her testimony helped expose a pattern of Medicare fraud at her hospital that resulted in millions of dollars in recovered funds and improved patient care. She sent me a card that simply said, "Thank you for showing me that my voice mattered." Stories like hers became the fuel that kept me going when the work felt overwhelming, when the problems seemed too big, when the system's too entrenched to change. Individual voices, one at a time, refusing to be silenced. But the most unexpected gift of this new life was romance. I met Patrick at a bookstore reading in Brooklyn, of all places. He was retired NYPD, a detective who'd spent 30 years working cases that most people preferred to ignore. Domestic violence, elder abuse, crimes against the city's most vulnerable populations. He approached me after the reading, not to gush about my story or ask for an autograph, but to discuss a case he'd worked where witness testimony from service workers had been crucial to achieving justice. "People like you," he said, "you see things the rest of us miss. You're invisible to the perpetrators, so they act like you're not there. But you're seeing everything." We talked for 2 hours in the bookstore cafe, comparing notes on the particular kind of blindness that comes with power, the way people reveal their true selves when they think no one important is watching. He asked if he could call me, and I said yes, then spent the next 3 days wondering if I was making a mistake. At 64, was I too old for romance, too set in my ways, too damaged by decades of disappointing relationships? Our first official date was dinner at a neighborhood Italian restaurant. Nothing fancy, just good food and easy conversation. He told me about his cases. I told him about the foundation, and we discovered a shared commitment to justice that had nothing to do with glory or recognition. He'd never been married, had devoted his career to protecting other people's families while never building one of his own. I'd been married and widowed and single for so long, I'd forgotten how to make space for another person in my life. But we were both past the age of games, of pretending to be someone we weren't, of trying to impress each other with anything other than honesty. The relationship developed slowly, built on shared values and genuine affection rather than passion or desperation. "I like who you are," he said one evening as we walked along the Brooklyn Heights promenade, the Manhattan skyline twinkling across the water. "Not who you used to be, not who you might become, but who you are right now, today." It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me, because it was exactly what I'd been searching for my entire adult life. Someone who saw me as I was and found that worthy of love. We were married on a beautiful September morning in Prospect Park, surrounded by Susan and her family, by Harrison and his adult children, by Mrs. Rodriguez and Martha from Georgia, and friends from the foundation, and people whose lives had intersected with mine in ways both large and small. I wore a simple blue dress, not white, because I was past the age of symbolizing purity, but blue because it was Patrick's favorite color and because it made me feel beautiful in my own skin. Susan walked me down the aisle, and when the officiant asked who gave this woman in marriage, she said, "She gives herself." The reception was in my apartment, our apartment now, with catered food from the neighborhood deli, and music from Patrick's old police department band, and speeches that made everyone cry with laughter and joy instead of sadness. Harrison raised his glass for a toast and said, "To Maggie, who taught me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars but in the courage to stand up for what's right." Susan followed with, "To my mother, who spent so many years taking care of everyone else that she almost forgot to take care of herself. I'm so proud of the woman you've become." But it was Mrs. Rodriguez who captured the essence of the day. "To my neighbor, who showed me that it's never too late to bloom." The marriage changed me in ways I hadn't expected. Not because Patrick completed me. I'd spent too many years learning to be complete on my own to believe in that romantic fiction, but because having a true partner changed how I moved through the world. For decades, I'd been alone with my thoughts, my fears, my dreams, my disappointments. Even during my marriage to Thomas, we'd been so focused on survival that we'd rarely had time for genuine intimacy, for the kind of deep sharing that builds real connection. But Patrick and I were past survival mode. We had the luxury of time, of conversation, of discovering each other slowly and with intention. He encouraged my work with the foundation, sometimes providing professional insight from his police background when cases involved potential criminal activity. But more importantly, he provided moral support for the emotional toll of constantly hearing stories about injustice and exploitation. "You can't save everyone," he reminded me, when I came home particularly frustrated after a case where we hadn't been able to help a domestic worker being exploited by her employers. "But you can save someone, and that someone will save someone else. The ripples spread farther than you can see." His presence in my life also gave me permission to enjoy simple pleasures without guilt. Weekend mornings spent reading the newspaper over coffee, evening walks along the waterfront, vacation trips to places I'd never imagined I'd see, Ireland to explore my family's roots, California to spend extended time with Susan and the grandchildren, even a cruise through the Caribbean because we could afford it and because I'd never been on a boat larger than the Staten Island ferry. Each new experience felt like recovering pieces of myself that had been buried under decades of necessity and sacrifice. I was still the same woman who'd stood up in that conference room, but I was also becoming someone I'd never had the chance to be: happy. The foundation's work continued to grow. We helped secure a $2.3 million settlement for a group of airport cleaning workers whose employer had been stealing from their pension fund. We provided legal support for hotel housekeepers, exposing sexual harassment by wealthy guests. We funded legal education programs for service workers, teaching them their rights and how to document workplace violations. But the most meaningful work was often the smallest: helping individual workers find the courage to speak up, providing emotional support during difficult legal proceedings, connecting people with resources and community when they felt isolated and powerless. One case particularly touched my heart. Maria Santos was a home health aide, caring for an elderly man whose adult children were stealing his Social Security payments while neglecting his care. She'd witnessed them forging checks, selling his medications, leaving him alone for days at a time while they pursued their own interests. She'd kept quiet for months, afraid of losing her job, afraid of not being believed, afraid of retaliation from a family with connections and resources she couldn't match. When she finally called the foundation's hotline, she was crying so hard she could barely speak. "I don't know what to do," she sobbed. "He's dying and they're killing him. But I'm just the hired help. Who's going to listen to me?" "I will," I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. We connected her with an attorney who specialized in elder abuse cases, helped her document the neglect and financial exploitation, provided emotional support as she testified before a grand jury that ultimately indicted the adult children on multiple felony charges. The elderly man was moved to a proper care facility where his needs were met and his dignity preserved for his final months. The stolen money was recovered and placed in a trust for his medical care. And Maria found her voice, eventually becoming a volunteer advocate for other home health workers facing similar situations. "You saved his life," she told me at the Foundation's annual benefit dinner, where we honored workers who'd shown courage in the face of adversity. "No," I replied, "you saved his life. I just helped you find the courage you already had." These moments of connection, of witnessing transformation in people who'd been told they didn't matter, became the fuel that powered my new life. Each victory, no matter how small, felt personal, a vindication not just of individual courage, but of the principle that every voice has value, every story has power, every person has worth beyond their utility to others. The years passed in a blur of meaningful work, growing relationships, and quiet contentment. Susan's children grew into teenagers who actually enjoyed spending time with their grandmother, probably because I was finally present for their lives rather than distracted by my own survival struggles. Sarah inherited my stubborn streak and channeled it into environmental activism. Michael developed his grandfather's mechanical aptitude and spent hours with Patrick learning how to fix everything from bicycles to leaky faucets. Harrison remained a close friend, our bond deepened by shared experience and mutual respect. His business interests shifted towards socially responsible investing, using his considerable wealth to support companies that treated workers fairly and respected environmental concerns. We collaborated on several projects through the Foundation, his financial resources amplifying the impact of our advocacy work. Mrs. Rodriguez passed away peacefully at 91, surrounded by the extended family she'd created through kindness rather than blood relation. I spoke at her funeral, telling stories about her generosity to everyone in the building, her fierce protection of vulnerable neighbors, her ability to see past surface differences to the humanity underneath. "She taught me," I said to the packed church, "that family isn't just the people you're born to, but the people who choose to love you despite your flaws and failures." Patrick's retirement from the police department allowed him to become more involved with the Foundation's work. His investigative skills proved invaluable in cases involving workplace fraud and corruption, and his contacts in law enforcement opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. But more than that, his presence gave me the confidence to take bigger risks, to tackle more ambitious cases, to speak out against injustices that might have seemed too powerful to challenge alone. When a major hotel chain was exposed for systematically exploiting housekeeping staff, stealing tips, forcing unpaid overtime, retaliating against workers who complained about unsafe conditions, we didn't just file a lawsuit. We organized a media campaign that brought national attention to the issue, ultimately resulting in a complete overhaul of the company's labor practices and $15 million in compensation for affected workers. 5 years ago, would you have believed you could take on a Fortune 500 company and win? Patrick asked me one evening as we celebrated the settlement over dinner. I thought about the question seriously. 5 years ago, I'd been invisible, voiceless, convinced that my thoughts and experiences didn't matter. The idea of challenging powerful institutions would have seemed not just impossible, but absurd. "No," I said finally. But 5 years ago, I didn't know who I really was. The realization crystallized something I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. This new life wasn't just about achieving justice for other people. It was about discovering that the woman I'd always been, observant, analytical, morally courageous, had always had value. The world had simply refused to recognize it. All those years of being dismissed as just a janitor hadn't diminished my worth. They'd hidden it, suppressed it, made it invisible to others and eventually to myself. but it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. That moment had come in a conference room on a cold February morning when a corrupt lawyer abandoned her client, and I found the courage to say, "I'll defend him." But the courage itself had been building for decades, through every injustice witnessed, every quiet act of service, every moment when I chose dignity over convenience. The speaking engagements continued, but they evolved from testimonials about my personal journey to broader discussions about systemic change. Universities invited me to lecture on workplace ethics. Labor organizations asked for my perspective on worker advocacy. Legal conferences wanted to explore the role of witness testimony in exposing corporate fraud. Each platform was an opportunity to amplify the central message, that every person has value, every voice matters, every story has power to create change. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The American Bar Association announced its annual award for legal advocacy, recognizing individuals who'd made significant contributions to justice despite not being trained lawyers. The award had previously been limited to judges, attorneys, and legal scholars. For the first time in the award's 50-year history, it was being given to a janitor. The ceremony was held at a luxury hotel in Washington, D.C., attended by hundreds of the country's most prestigious legal professionals. 5 years earlier, I would have been the one emptying their trash cans and cleaning their conference rooms. Now I was their honored guest. Harrison, Patrick, and Susan accompanied me to the ceremony. Susan had flown in from California with her family, wanting her children to see their grandmother receive such recognition. Patrick wore his dress uniform, looking handsome and proud. Harrison had offered his private jet for transportation, but we'd flown commercial because I still couldn't quite accept that level of luxury. The presenter was Justice Ruth Morrison, a Supreme Court justice whom I'd only seen on television. Standing at the podium in that grand ballroom, she began reading my biography. Margaret O'Sullivan worked for 37 years as a janitor at Blackstone and Associates in Manhattan. During that time, she was largely invisible to the attorneys, paralegals, and staff who benefited from her labor. She was overlooked, undervalued, and treated as if her thoughts and observations had no merit. I felt my cheeks burn with familiar shame, even in this moment of recognition. But Margaret was watching, she was listening, she was remembering, and when the moment came that required moral courage, she didn't hesitate to speak truth to power, even when that power had spent decades ignoring her voice. Justice Morrison paused, looking directly at me from across the room. The evidence Margaret provided didn't just exonerate an innocent man and expose corruption within a prestigious law firm. It demonstrated something the legal profession sometimes forgets, that justice depends not on credentials or status, but on individuals with the courage to tell the truth, regardless of personal cost. The standing ovation lasted several minutes. As I walked to the podium, my legs shaky with nerves and emotion, I looked out at hundreds of faces that would have intimidated me just years earlier. Lawyers, judges, legal scholars, people who'd spent their careers in pursuit of justice, now honoring a janitor who'd stumbled into it by accident. But as I began to speak, I realized it hadn't been an accident at all. Every year of invisible labor, every moment of quiet observation, every instance of being dismissed and overlooked had prepared me for that moment when my voice was needed most. "Thank you for this incredible honor," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "But I want to be clear about something. I'm not here because I'm special. I'm here because I finally learned that I was never as invisible as people pretended I was." I told them about the other janitors, the housekeepers, the security guards, the maintenance workers who kept their offices and courthouses running while they pursued justice for their clients. "These people see everything," I said. "They hear every conversation, witness every interaction, observe every moment when you think no one important is watching. The question isn't whether they have valuable insights. The question is whether you're listening." The response was electric. These were people who dedicated their careers to uncovering truth, and I was challenging them to recognize sources of truth they'd been ignoring. Justice, I continued, isn't just about legal expertise or courtroom strategy. It's about moral courage, and that can be found in anyone, regardless of education, position, or social status. My story isn't remarkable because a janitor exposed corruption. It's remarkable because it took 37 years for anyone to listen to what I had to say. The ovation that followed was different from the polite applause that had greeted my arrival. This was recognition, understanding, the sound of minds changing in real time. Afterward, dozens of attorneys approached me with their business cards, wanting to discuss cases where service worker testimony might be crucial. Law schools reached out about developing curricula that addressed the importance of non-traditional witnesses. Bar associations across the country invited me to speak about expanding their definitions of legal advocacy. But the conversation that mattered most happened in the hotel bar later that evening when a young public defender approached our table. "Ms. O'Sullivan," she said nervously, "I wanted to thank you. I've been working on a case where the key witness is a hotel housekeeper, but my supervisors think her testimony won't carry weight with the jury because of her background. After hearing you speak tonight, I'm going to fight harder to make sure her voice is heard." "What's her story?" I asked. "She witnessed a sexual assault by a prominent businessman, but the defense is going to argue that she's not credible because she's undocumented and doesn't speak perfect English. Everyone says the case is unwinnable." I thought about my own hesitation to come forward, about all the reasons I'd told myself my voice didn't matter. "Tell me," I said. "Does she know what she saw?" "Absolutely. Her account is detailed and consistent." "Then fight for her," I said simply. "Not because you'll definitely win, but because her truth deserves to be heard." That's what justice actually looks like. 6 months later, that attorney called to tell me the jury had believed the housekeeper's testimony. The businessman was convicted and sentenced to 12 years in prison. The housekeeper, who'd been terrified to come forward, had found her voice and used it to protect other women from a predator who'd thought his wealth and status made him untouchable. Stories like this became the Foundation's legacy, not just the high-profile cases that made headlines, but the individual moments when invisible people found their voices and changed the world in ways both small and profound. As I entered my 70s, I began thinking about the future of the work I'd started. The Foundation was financially secure, with an endowment that would support its mission for decades. Patrick and I had established a scholarship fund for children of service workers who wanted to pursue legal education. Harrison had pledged a substantial portion of his estate to organizations supporting workplace advocacy. But the most important legacy wasn't financial. It was the network of voices we'd helped empower, the culture of courage we'd fostered, the shift in consciousness that recognized the value of every person's truth. Susan moved back to New York when her husband's job relocated to the East Coast, bringing my grandchildren back into my daily life. Watching Sarah, now 16, organize protests against climate change in action, I saw my own moral courage reflected in a new generation. When Michael, 14, stood up to bullies who were picking on a classmate with learning disabilities, I recognized the same instinct to protect the vulnerable that had driven my own transformation. "Grandma," Sarah said one afternoon as we prepared dinner together in my kitchen, "do you ever regret not speaking up sooner? Like, if you'd found your voice when you were younger, how different would your life have been?" It was a question I'd asked myself countless times, especially during the long nights when old regrets surfaced despite my contentment with the present. "I used to regret the lost time," I said honestly. "All those years when I accepted less than I deserved, when I stayed silent about things that mattered. But now I think those years weren't wasted. They were preparation." Preparation for what? For understanding what really matters, for recognizing injustice when I see it, for having the life experience to know that speaking up is worth the risk, because staying silent is worse. She nodded thoughtfully, and I could see her processing the idea that even painful experiences could have value, that suffering didn't have to be meaningless if it led to wisdom and purpose. Besides, I added, if I'd found my voice earlier, I might not have been in that conference room on the day Mr. Blackwood needed someone to defend him. Maybe everything happened exactly when it was supposed to. The Foundation's 10th anniversary celebration was held at the same community center in the Bronx where I'd given my first public speech so many years earlier. The room was packed with people whose lives had intersected with our work, workers who'd found their voices, attorneys who'd learned to listen, family members who'd supported difficult journeys toward truth and justice. Maria Santos, the home health aide who'd saved her elderly client from abuse, served as the evening's master of ceremonies. Her transformation from terrified witness to confident advocate embodied everything we'd hoped to accomplish. 10 years ago, she said, addressing the crowd, I thought my voice didn't matter because I was poor, because English wasn't my first language, because I was just hired help. Maggie O'Sullivan taught me that every voice matters, that every truth has power, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The testimonials continued throughout the evening. Workers who'd exposed fraud, whistleblowers who'd prevented safety violations, witnesses who'd put predators behind bars. Each story was different, but they all shared common threads: the initial fear of speaking up, the support they'd received in finding their voices, the transformation that came from being heard and believed. Patrick gave a speech about the ripple effects of courage, how one person's decision to speak truth could inspire others, creating waves of change that spread far beyond the original act of bravery. Harrison talked about the importance of using privilege and resources to amplify voices that had been silenced, acknowledging that wealthy people like himself had a responsibility to listen to perspectives they might otherwise never hear. But it was Susan's words that moved me most deeply. My mother spent most of her life making herself smaller so other people could feel bigger. She apologized for taking up space, for having needs, for existing in places where her presence was inconvenient. Watching her find her voice, seeing her recognize her own worth, has been the greatest gift of my adult life. Not because she became famous or successful, but because she became authentically herself. When it was my turn to speak, I found myself looking out at faces that represented every stage of my journey, from the invisible years through the breakthrough moment to the purposeful life I'd built in its aftermath. When I stood up in that conference room 11 years ago, I began, I thought I was just defending one man from injustice. I didn't realize I was also defending myself from a lifetime of silence. I didn't know that finding my voice would mean helping others find theirs. I paused, thinking about all the stories I'd heard over the years, all the courage I'd witnessed, all the changes that had grown from individual moments of moral bravery. The most important thing I've learned is this: your worth is not determined by how others treat you. Your voice has power, regardless of who's listening. Your truth matters even when it's inconvenient for people in authority. I looked directly at the service workers in the audience, recognizing in their faces the mixture of hope and fear I'd carried for so many years. To those of you who clean offices while executives make millions, who care for children while parents pursue careers, who maintain buildings while residents enjoy luxury, you are not invisible. You are not expendable. You are not less important than the people you serve. Your observations matter. Your experiences have value. Your voices can change the world. The ovation that followed felt like validation not just for my work, but for every person who'd ever been dismissed, overlooked, or treated as if their humanity was secondary to their utility. As the evening wound down and people began filtering out into the Bronx night, I found myself standing in the same spot where I'd given that first terrifying speech about finding my voice. The circle felt complete, but not finished, more like the end of one movement and the beginning of another. Mrs. Chen, the community center director, approached with tears in her eyes. "Maggie," she said, "do you know what you've done here? This isn't just about your story anymore. You've created a movement. People leave these events believing that their lives matter, that their voices have power. That changes everything. Later that night, as Patrick and I rode the subway back to Brooklyn, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. From invisible janitor to recognized advocate, from silent observer to powerful voice, from someone who accepted dismissal to someone who demanded dignity. The train car was mostly empty at that late hour, just a few night shift workers heading home, a couple of students with textbooks in their laps, an elderly man dozing against the window. A few years ago, I might have seen myself in their quiet resignation, their tired acceptance of lives lived in the margins. Now I saw potential. Every person on that train had stories worth telling, insights worth sharing, truths worth hearing. The challenge was creating a world that would listen. "What are you thinking about?" Patrick asked, squeezing my hand. "How many more voices are out there?" I said. "How many people have important things to say but haven't found the courage or the platform to say them? And how much work there is still to do." He smiled, understanding that retirement was not in my vocabulary, that purpose had become more important than rest. The Foundation's work continued to evolve and expand. We launched a podcast featuring stories from workers across different industries, giving voice to experiences that rarely made mainstream media. We developed partnerships with journalism schools, training future reporters to recognize and value perspectives from marginalized communities. We created legal clinics that provided free services to workers facing retaliation for speaking out about workplace abuses. But perhaps most importantly, we began working with employers to create cultures where worker voices were valued and respected. Rather than simply responding to abuse after it occurred, we focused on prevention through education and systemic change. The transformation wasn't always easy or welcome. Many employers resented being challenged by people they'd considered expendable. Some workers struggled with the responsibility that came with having their voices heard and valued. Change, even positive change, creates disruption and discomfort. But the results spoke for themselves. Workplace safety improved when workers felt safe reporting hazards. Customer service got better when management listened to employee insights about client needs. Even productivity increased when workers felt valued as human beings, rather than interchangeable units of labor. My personal life continued to flourish alongside the professional success. Patrick and I traveled extensively, finally seeing the world beyond the narrow confines of necessity and survival. We visited Ireland to explore my family's genealogical roots, discovering relatives I'd never known existed, and stories about ancestors who'd faced their own struggles with dignity and courage. We spent extended time in California with Susan's family, building relationships with grandchildren who now saw me not as the distant figure who sent birthday cards and holiday gifts, but as a real person with stories worth hearing and wisdom worth seeking. Sarah, now in college studying environmental law, credited my example with inspiring her career choice. "You showed me that one person really can make a difference," she told me during one of our regular video calls, "that you don't have to be rich or powerful to fight for what's right. You just have to care enough to speak up." Michael, pursuing engineering with a focus on sustainable design, had inherited my practical problem-solving approach and Patrick's mechanical aptitude. His goal was to design affordable housing that would give working families the kind of security I'd never had during my early years in New York. Watching my grandchildren pursue careers focused on service and justice felt like the ultimate validation that voices raised in courage could echo across generations. The speaking engagements continued, but they took on different themes as I aged. Rather than focusing entirely on workplace advocacy, I began addressing broader questions about dignity, purpose, and the search for meaning in the later stages of life. At a conference for senior citizens, I spoke about the difference between feeling old and feeling used up. Age brings limitations, I acknowledged. Our bodies don't move as easily, our energy levels decrease, our roles in the world shift as we retire from careers and watch younger generations take over. But limitations are not the same as worthlessness. I looked out at faces lined with decades of experience, People who'd raised families, built careers, contributed to their communities, and now worried that their best days were behind them. Your value isn't determined by your productivity, I continued. Your worth isn't measured by your usefulness to others. You matter because you exist, because you have stories that only you can tell, because your perspective is unique and valuable, regardless of your age or physical condition. An elderly man in the audience raised his hand. But what if no one wants to hear our stories? What if we feel invisible? The question cut straight to the heart of my own experience, to the decades I'd spent feeling unseen and unheard. Then you do what I did, I replied. You speak up anyway. You tell your stories to whoever will listen, even if it's just one person. You refuse to accept invisibility as inevitable. You insist on your right to be seen and heard, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. The response was overwhelming. People lined up after the presentation to share their own stories of feeling dismissed, overlooked, or irrelevant in their golden years. Many had rich experiences and hard-won wisdom, but felt that society had no interest in what they had to offer. That conference inspired a new initiative through the foundation, the Elder Voices Project, which connected older adults with younger people seeking mentorship, guidance, and historical perspective. The program matched retired workers with current employees facing similar challenges, created oral history projects that preserved important stories, and established speaker bureaus that brought elderly voices into schools and community organizations. The project proved that invisibility was a choice made by society, not an inevitable consequence of aging. When platforms were created and audiences were cultivated, older adults had profound wisdom to share about resilience, adaptation, and finding meaning through hardship. One of the most moving connections was between Maria Santos, now in her 60s, and still involved with the foundation as a volunteer advocate, and a young home health aide named Carmen Rodriguez, who was facing similar challenges with exploitation and abuse. Watching Maria guide Carmen through the process of documenting workplace violations and finding her voice felt like witnessing the completion of a circle. The frightened woman who'd once sobbed into our hotline had become the mentor helping others navigate similar fears and uncertainties. It's not easier the second time, Maria confided to me after one of their sessions. Watching Carmen struggle with the same fears I had, seeing her face the same threats and intimidation, it brings back all my own painful memories. Then why do you do it? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Because someone listened to me when I needed it most. Because my voice mattered when I thought it didn't. Because now it's my turn to listen. These connections became the foundation's most sustainable legacy. Rather than depending entirely on professional advocates and legal experts, we were creating networks of peer support where people with shared experiences could help each other find courage and navigate challenges. The model spread beyond workplace advocacy into other areas. Formerly homeless individuals mentoring people transitioning out of shelters, ex-prisoners supporting others re-entering society, domestic violence survivors counseling women in similar situations. Each connection reinforced the central principle that had guided my own transformation. Every person has value. Every experience has wisdom to offer. Every voice has the power to help someone else find their courage. As I approached my 75th birthday, I began working on what I knew would be my final book. Not another memoir or collection of other people's stories, but a practical guide for people seeking to find their voices in whatever circumstances they faced. The Courage to Speak, a guide to finding your voice in an indifferent world, drew on everything I'd learned through my own journey and the hundreds of stories I'd collected over the years. It offered concrete strategies for documenting injustices, building support networks, overcoming fear, and sustaining hope through difficult processes of change. But more than tactics and techniques, it tried to address the emotional and spiritual aspects of transformation. How to maintain dignity in dehumanizing situations, how to find strength in community, how to hold on to hope when systems seem too entrenched to change. The hardest chapter to write was about forgiveness, not the superficial kind that ignores real harm, but the deeper process of releasing resentment in order to move forward with purpose and peace. Forgiveness, I wrote, is not about excusing other people's behavior or pretending that injustice doesn't matter. It's about refusing to let their failures define your future. It's about choosing healing over hatred, growth over stagnation, purpose over bitterness. I thought about Victoria Sterling, now serving her sentence in federal prison, probably still convinced that she'd been the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of her own downfall. I thought about the partners at Blackstone and Associates who'd treated me as invisible for decades, likely unaware that their casual cruelty had contributed to my transformation. I felt neither hatred nor love for these people, just a kind of neutral acceptance that their treatment of me had been part of a journey toward becoming who I was meant to be. Their cruelty hadn't defined me, but my response to it had. The book tour for The Courage to Speak was different from my previous experiences. At 75, I was no longer the surprising janitor who'd exposed corruption. I was a recognized advocate, an established voice in conversations about workplace justice and human dignity. But the audiences were the same. People who felt voiceless, invisible, dismissed by systems that valued productivity over humanity. The settings ranged from community centers to university lecture halls, from union meetings to corporate conferences. But the underlying needs were consistent: validation, encouragement, practical guidance, and hope. At a military base where I spoke to veterans struggling with PTSD and transition challenges, a young Marine asked the question that had followed me throughout my advocacy work. How do you keep going when it feels like nothing changes? When you speak up and nothing happens, when you fight and still lose, when you tell your story and people don't listen? I thought about all the cases that hadn't resulted in justice, all the workers who'd found their voices but still lost their jobs, all the systems that remained stubbornly resistant to change despite overwhelming evidence of their failures. You keep going, I said, because the alternative is giving up on yourself and everyone who comes after you. Change is slow and uneven and often invisible until it reaches a tipping point. But it's always happening, one voice at a time, one story at a time, one moment of courage at a time. I paused, looking at faces marked by their own battles with trauma and institutional indifference. And you keep going because your voice has already changed someone, even if you don't know it yet. Someone heard your story and found courage. Someone witnessed your resilience and decided not to give up. Someone saw your dignity in the face of indignity and remembered that they have worth too. It was a variation of something I'd said hundreds of times at countless events, but it never stopped being true. The ripple effects of courage were real, even when they were invisible to the person creating them. That Marine approached me after the event with tears in his eyes. "I've been thinking about ending it all," he said quietly. "The nightmares, the guilt, the way people look at me when I can't handle crowds or loud noises. But hearing you tonight, hearing how you found your voice after so many years of silence, it makes me think maybe there's still time for me to find mine." We talked for another 30 minutes about resources for veteran support, about the difference between giving up and starting over, about the possibility of transformation even in the darkest moments. 3 months later, he sent me a letter reporting that he'd started therapy, joined a veteran support group, and begun volunteering at a homeless shelter where his own experiences with trauma helped him connect with others struggling with similar challenges. "My voice is shaky and small," he wrote, "but it's getting stronger every day." Stories like his reminded me why the work mattered, even when progress felt slow or individual victories seemed insignificant against the magnitude of systemic problems. The Foundation's impact continued to grow and evolve. Our legal advocacy had secured more than $50 million in settlements for exploited workers. Our support networks had helped thousands of people find their voices and fight for their rights. Our educational programs had changed policies at hundreds of companies, making workplaces safer and more dignified for millions of employees. But the number I was most proud of was different. Over 1,500 people had contacted us to report that attending our events or reading our materials had inspired them to speak up about injustices in their own lives. 1,500 ripples spreading outward in ways we'd never be able to track or measure fully. The Foundation's board began planning for succession as I prepared to step back from daily operations. Patrick, now 80 himself, was eager to spend more time traveling and less time managing the administrative aspects of advocacy work. We'd found the perfect successor in Carmen Rodriguez, the young home health aide whom Maria Santos had mentored. Carmen had completed her GED, earned her bachelor's degree through night school, and was finishing law school with a specialization in workplace advocacy. More importantly, she understood the mission from the inside. She'd lived the experience of being invisible, of having her voice dismissed, of fearing retaliation for speaking truth to power. Her leadership would ensure that the Foundation remained grounded in the real experiences of workers rather than the abstract theories of people who'd never faced exploitation. "The work changes when you hand it over to someone else," Harrison observed during one of our regular lunch meetings. "It's no longer about your story, your voice, your particular way of fighting injustice. It becomes something bigger and more sustainable." He was right. Watching Carmen take over more responsibilities, seeing her bring fresh energy and new perspectives to problems I'd been working on for years, felt like watching a child grow into an independent adult, proud and bittersweet and ultimately liberating. My role shifted from leader to elder advisor, from primary voice to supporting chorus. Instead of giving speeches about finding courage, I introduced speakers who were living that courage in real time. Instead of developing new programs, I shared stories with young advocates about what had worked, what had failed, and what they might try differently. The transition wasn't always smooth. There were moments when I struggled with becoming less central to work that had defined my identity for more than a decade. There were decisions made that I would have handled differently, approaches taken that seemed less effective than methods I'd developed through hard experience. But there were also innovations that exceeded anything I'd imagined, connections formed that I never could have facilitated, victories achieved through strategies I never would have considered. Carmen's generation brought technological sophistication that amplified traditional advocacy methods, social media campaigns that reached millions of workers with information about their rights, apps that allowed people to document workplace violations securely and anonymously, online networks that connected isolated workers with peer support and legal resources. They also brought a more intersectional understanding of injustice, recognizing how racism, sexism, ageism, and economic exploitation interconnected in complex ways. Their approach to advocacy addressed not just workplace abuse, but the broader systems of inequality that made such abuse possible and profitable. Watching them work, I felt like a grandmother seeing grandchildren achieve things she'd never imagined possible. The foundation I'd started as a platform for invisible voices had evolved into something far more sophisticated and impactful than I'd ever envisioned. Patrick and I used our newfound freedom to pursue interests we'd deferred during the intensive years of building the foundation. We took art classes together, discovering that neither of us had any talent for painting, but both enjoyed the meditative process of creating something beautiful, even if it was objectively terrible. We volunteered at the local library, reading to children during story time and helping adults with literacy challenges. The work was quiet and unglamorous, nothing like the high-profile advocacy that had dominated my recent years, but it connected me to the kind of direct service that had always fed my soul. We traveled more extensively, not to exotic destinations, but to small American cities where we could explore local history, meet new people, and see how different communities were addressing challenges similar to those we'd worked on in New York. In Birmingham, we visited civil rights museums and talked with elderly activists who'd fought battles that made my own struggles seem insignificant by comparison. In Detroit, we met with union organizers who were adapting traditional labor advocacy to address the economic devastation of deindustrialization. Each conversation reminded me that courage wasn't unique to any particular time period or individual. Every generation faced injustices that required ordinary people to find extraordinary voices. The specific issues changed, but the fundamental challenge remained constant: how to maintain human dignity in systems designed to reduce people to their economic value. My health began declining gradually in my late 70s. Nothing dramatic or sudden, just the accumulating limitations that come with age. Arthritis that made long days of activity painful, hearing loss that made large group conversations difficult, fatigue that required more rest and fewer commitments. Patrick's health was failing more rapidly. A series of small strokes affected his mobility and cognitive function, requiring increasing levels of care and assistance. The man who'd been my partner, my equal, my companion in adventure, was becoming someone I needed to protect and care for. The role reversal was challenging, but not unfamiliar. I'd spent my early years caring for elderly neighbors, my middle years serving the needs of others, my later years advocating for people who couldn't speak for themselves. Caring for Patrick felt like returning to my fundamental nature, but with the confidence and resources I'd gained through my journey. We hired home health aides to assist with his daily needs, choosing carefully from agencies that respected worker rights and paid living wages. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now the employer, rather than the employee, responsible for treating vulnerable workers with the dignity I'd once craved. Maria Santos, now in her 70s herself, became a frequent visitor. Her own experience as a home health aide gave her insights into Patrick's needs that I might have missed, and her advocacy training helped her ensure that his care team was treating him as a person rather than just a patient. "It's different, isn't it?" she said one afternoon as we watched Patrick working with his physical therapist, seeing care work from the other side, understanding how much skill and compassion it requires when it's someone you love who needs it. She was right. All those years of witnessing home health aides, housekeepers, and other care workers being dismissed as unskilled labor had gained new meaning now that Patrick's quality of life depended on their expertise, patience, and dedication. I made sure his care workers were paid well above market rates, received health insurance and retirement benefits, and were treated as valued professionals rather than servants. It was a small gesture compared to the systemic changes needed throughout the industry, but it felt important to practice what I'd preached during my advocacy years. Patrick's condition stabilized for several months, allowing us to enjoy a kind of peaceful routine. Morning coffee together while reading newspapers aloud to each other. Afternoon walks in the neighborhood, moving slowly but still covering several blocks. Evening television viewing, focusing on old movies and documentaries rather than the news programs that had once consumed so much of our attention. He remained intellectually sharp even as his physical capabilities declined, offering insights about the Foundation's work and encouragement for my writing projects. His police training had given him a different perspective on justice and systemic change, and I continued to value his counsel even when he could no longer participate actively in advocacy work. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked one evening as we sat on our balcony watching the sunset paint the Hudson River gold and crimson. "Regret what?" "All of it. The years you lost being invisible. The energy you spent fighting battles you shouldn't have had to fight. The fact that it took so long to find your voice." It was a question I'd been asked countless times by reporters, audience members, and people struggling with their own journeys toward self-advocacy. But coming from Patrick, after 8 years of marriage built on complete honesty and mutual respect, it felt different. I thought about Margaret O'Sullivan at 35, exhausted and invisible, scrubbing office floors while her daughter performed in school plays to empty auditoriums. I thought about Margaret O'Sullivan at 55, still accepting dismissal and humiliation as natural conditions of her existence. And I thought about Margaret O'Sullivan at 78, surrounded by meaningful work, loving relationships, financial security, and the deep satisfaction that comes from using one's voice in service of justice. "I regret the pain," I said finally. "I regret the loneliness and the fear and the years when I accepted less than I deserved. But I don't regret the journey, because it led me to everything that matters most. To you, to Susan and the grandchildren, to work that makes a difference, to understanding my own worth. Even if you could go back and change things, give your younger self the courage to speak up sooner?" "Maybe," I said. "But then again, maybe I needed those years of observation and accumulation of wisdom before I was ready to use my voice effectively. Maybe everything happened exactly when it was supposed to." Patrick nodded, satisfied with an answer that acknowledged complexity rather than offering simple reassurance. Our relationship had always been built on that kind of honesty, the ability to sit with difficult questions without rushing toward easy answers. He died peacefully in his sleep on a warm September morning, 3 months after that conversation. I woke up to find him still beside me, looking younger and more peaceful than he had in months, finally free from the limitations that had increasingly constrained their life together. The grief was profound, but not devastating. We'd had 8 wonderful years together, more than many couples get in a lifetime, and our relationship had been built on gratitude rather than need. I missed him terribly, but I wasn't lost without him. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives we'd touched through our advocacy work. Police officers Patrick had served with, workers whose voices we'd helped amplify, attorneys who'd learned to value non-traditional witnesses, community members who'd been inspired by our example. Carmen gave a eulogy that captured Patrick's essential character. Patrick understood that justice wasn't just about legal victories or policy changes. It was about treating every person with dignity, regardless of their status or circumstances. He brought that understanding to everything he did, as a police officer, as an advocate, as a husband, as a friend. Harrison spoke about Patrick's role in transforming the foundation from personal mission to sustainable movement. He taught us that real change happens not through individual heroics, but through building networks of support that outlast any single person's involvement. His legacy lives in every person who finds their voice, because he helped create systems that amplify marginalized perspectives. But it was Susan's words that moved me most deeply. Patrick gave my mother something she'd never had before, a partner who saw her worth from the very beginning. He didn't fall in love with the famous advocate or the courageous whistleblower. He fell in love with Maggie O'Sullivan, exactly as she was, at exactly the moment she was discovering her own value. After the service, as people gathered at our apartment to share memories and support each other through grief, I found myself thinking about the conversation Patrick and I had shared on the balcony just a few months earlier. Did I regret the journey that had brought me to this moment? Standing in a home filled with love, surrounded by people whose lives had been enriched by work I'd never planned to do, carrying memories of a marriage that had exceeded my highest hopes? No, I didn't regret anything. Every disappointment had taught me resilience. Every humiliation had revealed my dignity. Every moment of invisibility had prepared me to see and advocate for other invisible people. The weeks following Patrick's death were difficult, but not empty. Susan stayed with me for a month, helping sort through his belongings and providing the kind of companionship that comes from shared grief. The grandchildren, now in their 20s, took turns visiting to ensure I wasn't alone too often. But mostly, I was okay with being alone. I'd spent so many years afraid of solitude, equating it with abandonment or failure. But the solitude I experienced now was different, chosen rather than imposed, peaceful rather than desperate, full of memories rather than empty of connection. I began writing again, not for publication, but for personal reflection. Journal entries that processed grief, explored memories, and considered what remained to be accomplished in whatever years I had left. The foundation continued to thrive under Carmen's leadership, but with less need for my direct involvement. I attended board meetings, offered advice when asked, and participated in major strategic discussions, but the day-to-day operations moved forward without my constant oversight. This transition felt natural rather than forced. I'd always known that sustainable change required systems that could outlast their founders, and watching the foundation evolve beyond my personal vision felt like the ultimate measure of success. Harrison remained a close friend and frequent companion, though he was facing his own challenges with aging and declining health. Our friendship deepened as we both grappled with questions about legacy, meaning, and how to use remaining time most purposefully. "What do you want people to remember about you?" he asked during one of our increasingly philosophical conversations. I thought about the question for several days before answering. Fame had never been the goal, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be remembered as an individual rather than as part of a larger movement toward justice and human dignity. "I want them to remember that voices matter," I said finally. "That every person has value regardless of how society categorizes them. That courage is possible at any age, in any circumstances, for anyone who decides their truth is worth sharing." "And personally? How do you want the people who knew you to remember Margaret O'Sullivan?" That question was harder. Personal legacy felt less important than social impact, but it also felt more intimate, more connected to my essential self rather than my public role. I want them to remember that I tried to treat everyone with dignity, even when they didn't treat me the same way. That I fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves, that I chose love over bitterness, hope over despair, connection over isolation. Even after everything you endured, all the years of being dismissed and humiliated, especially after that, because that's what made me who I am today. The conversation stayed with me as I continued working on my private writing. What legacy was I actually leaving? Not just through the foundation or the books or the speeches, but through the individual interactions, the daily choices, the way I'd treated people when no one was watching. I thought about the home health aides caring for Patrick, and how I'd insisted on treating them as professionals rather than servants. I thought about the young advocates at the foundation, and how I'd tried to mentor them without imposing my own approaches on their work. I thought about the strangers who'd approached me at speaking events, and how I'd tried to truly listen to their stories rather than just waiting for my turn to talk. These moments of connection, largely invisible to the outside world, felt like they might be the most important parts of whatever legacy I was building. My 80th birthday was celebrated with a gathering that included several generations of people whose lives had intersected with mine. Susan's family, foundation staff and volunteers, community activists, former co-workers, neighbors, and friends filled the community room of my building for an afternoon of food, speeches, and storytelling. Maria Santos organized a memory book, collecting written reflections from people who'd been influenced by my work or friendship. Reading through the entries later that evening, I was struck by how often people mentioned small gestures rather than grand achievements. A housekeeper who'd found courage to report sexual harassment wrote about how I'd listened to her entire story without interrupting or rushing to solutions. A young attorney wrote about how I'd encouraged her to value clients regardless of their social status. A neighbor wrote about how I'd helped her elderly mother navigate Medicare paperwork, treating the tedious process as important work rather than an inconvenience. These were the moments that had mattered most to the people who'd experienced them, even though they'd felt routine and unremarkable to me at the time. The biggest surprise was a letter from Victoria Sterling, written from federal prison where she was now serving the final years of her sentence. I hadn't expected to hear from her ever again, and opening the envelope brought back memories of the corruption trial that had changed both our lives so dramatically. "Dear Margaret," the letter began, using my first name for what might have been the first time in our decades of acquaintance. I've had many years to think about what happened between us, and I wanted to offer something I should have given you long ago. An apology and an acknowledgement of your courage. When I walked out of that conference room and abandoned Harrison, I thought I was protecting my career and my reputation. I told myself that you were just an opportunistic janitor trying to insert yourself into situations beyond your understanding. But you weren't opportunistic. You were moral. And you understood more about justice than I did, despite my law degree and prestigious position. I spent 37 years treating you as invisible, and you spent 37 years observing, learning, and maintaining your integrity while I compromised mine. When the moment came that required real courage, you found it within yourself while I ran away. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm simply acknowledging that you were right and I was wrong, about the case and about your worth as a person. Prison has given me time to read your books and learn about the Foundation's work. I'm proud that someone who endured my arrogance and cruelty chose to use their voice for justice rather than revenge. Thank you for defending Harrison when I wouldn't. Thank you for speaking truth when I chose silence. Thank you for showing that dignity matters more than status, that courage can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that it's never too late to choose what's right over what's convenient. With respect and regret, Victoria Sterling. The letter shook me more than I'd expected. Over the years, I'd received thousands of messages from people inspired by my story, but none that acknowledged such fundamental transformation in the sender. Victoria's words suggested that even people who'd seemed irredeemably committed to systems of oppression could develop consciousness and regret. I showed the letter to Carmen, curious about her reaction as someone who'd never experienced the humiliation Victoria had inflicted during my invisible years. "Are you going to write back?" she asked after reading it carefully. "I don't know. Part of me feels like she deserves acknowledgement for taking responsibility. Part of me thinks some harm is too deep for letters to address." Carmen nodded thoughtfully. "What would help you feel most at peace?" It was exactly the right question. Not what Victoria deserved, not what others might expect, but what would contribute to my own sense of completion and harmony. I decided to write a brief reply, not forgiving or condemning, but acknowledging her letter and expressing hope for her continued growth. "Dear Victoria," I wrote, "thank you for your letter and your acknowledgement of the harm caused by systems that treat some people as disposable. I hope your remaining time in prison contributes to reflection and growth that serves you well upon your release. The Foundation continues to work toward a world where every person's dignity is respected, regardless of their position or circumstances. M.W." The exchange felt like closing a circle that had been open for more than a decade, not with reconciliation or friendship, but with recognition that even our most difficult relationships could contribute to understanding and growth. As I entered my 80s, my health became more fragile and my energy more limited. I stopped traveling for speaking engagements and reduced my writing commitments to projects that felt most essential. But I also experienced a kind of freedom that had eluded me throughout the more intensive years of advocacy work. With fewer obligations and demands on my time, I could focus on the relationships and activities that brought me the most joy. I spent long afternoons with Susan and her family, finally present for the grandchildren's lives in ways I'd never managed with Susan herself. I volunteered reading to children at the local library, rediscovering the simple pleasure of sharing stories without any agenda beyond entertainment and connection. I tended a small garden on my balcony, growing herbs and vegetables that connected me to the earth in ways I'd missed during my decades of urban living. The physical act of nurturing plants from seeds to harvest felt meditative and meaningful. A reminder that growth and transformation were possible at any stage of life. Most surprisingly, I began painting again for the first time since high school. My arthritis made detailed work difficult, but I found satisfaction in broad strokes of color that captured emotions and memories rather than realistic depictions. The paintings were objectively terrible, but creating them brought me peace and helped process complex feelings about aging, loss, and legacy. The foundation held its 15th anniversary celebration without me, as I was recovering from pneumonia that had left me too weak to attend large gatherings. But Carmen visited afterward to share stories from the event and show me videos that board members had recorded. The celebration had grown beyond anything I'd envisioned, with attendees from across the country representing dozens of organizations that had been inspired by our model. Workers who'd found their voices, attorneys who'd learned to listen, employers who'd changed their practices, journalists who'd begun covering marginalized perspectives, all connected through ripples of courage that continued spreading outward. "It's bigger than any of us now," Carmen said as we watched footage of young advocates sharing their own stories of transformation. The specific techniques and approaches keep evolving, but the core message remains the same. Every voice has value, every person deserves dignity, every truth has power to create change. Watching those young faces, hearing their passion for justice, seeing their commitment to amplifying marginalized voices, I felt the deepest satisfaction of my entire life. Not because they were copying my methods or crediting my influence, but because they were carrying forward the values that had motivated my own transformation. The movement I'd accidentally helped start by standing up in a conference room 20 years earlier had become something autonomous and sustainable, no longer dependent on any single person's involvement or inspiration. That evening, as I sat alone in my apartment looking out at the city lights of Manhattan, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment of peace and completion. From invisible janitor to recognized advocate, from silent observer to powerful voice, from woman who accepted dismissal to woman who demanded dignity, from someone who served others at the expense of herself to someone who served justice while honoring her own worth. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, but it had been real and lasting. More importantly, it had created changes that extended far beyond my personal circumstances. How many voices had been amplified because I'd found mine? How many people had discovered their courage because I'd shared my story? How many systems had become more just because someone finally insisted that invisible people deserved to be seen? I couldn't measure these impacts precisely, but I could feel their reality in the messages I continued receiving, the stories I continued hearing, the changes I continued witnessing in workplaces and communities across the country. My voice, once silenced by fear and conditioning, had helped create a chorus of other voices that would continue long after mine was stilled. As I prepared for sleep that night, I thought about the question Harrison had asked me years earlier about regret. Did I regret the decades of invisibility, the years of accepting less than I deserved, the late start on discovering my own worth? The answer remained the same. No. Every experience had contributed to who I'd become. Every struggle had taught me something essential about resilience, dignity, and the power of truth. The invisible years hadn't been wasted time. They'd been preparation for the visible years that followed. And now, as I faced whatever remained of my life, I was ready to embrace both visibility and invisibility, voice and silence, leadership and rest, with equal grace and acceptance. I was Margaret O'Sullivan. I had been a janitor, an advocate, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a friend. I had been invisible and visible, silent and vocal, dismissed and celebrated. But through it all, I had been human, worthy of dignity, deserving of respect, valuable regardless of how others chose to see me. That knowledge, hard-won and deeply held, was my most precious possession and my most important gift to the world. My story was ending, but the stories it had inspired would continue. My voice was quieting, but the chorus it had helped create would sing on. And that was enough. That was everything. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life, dismissed by people who should have valued your contributions? Have you watched someone sacrifice their dignity for others' convenience, or wondered when it might be time to finally speak up? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters more than you know. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe, because it helps us reach other people who work tirelessly behind the scenes, giving their all without recognition. To continue this journey of powerful emotional stories, we've created a special podcast just as heartfelt as this one. You can find it here on the left. Thank you for being part of this journey of the heart. I'll see you in the next story.